If you're a B2B business, a B2B tech company, or a B2B marketer, you're in the right place. Coming to you from Studio 26, this is the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast, bringing you interesting contemporary takes, industry tips, guest interviews, and true stories from B2B marketers in the trenches. Now, here's your host, Steve Goldhaber.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Studio 26 and the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. It's your host, Steve here. Excited for the show today. Welcome to the show, Mark. How you doing?
Yeah, very good, Steve. Really looking forward to sharing a few case studies today.
Awesome. Yeah. So before we do that, let's just give the audience a little bit of an understanding of your background. So give us the 60-second overview of who you are.
60 seconds, 36 years and 60 seconds. But so really my professional career has been 14 years in B2B sales and marketing. I started in recruitment, but there's a sales angle to recruitment. I then moved into marketing, got my first role in marketing as an online marketing manager. That's before there was a digital marketing manager as a job title, and then moved my way into working into revenue leadership roles, most recently running a 100-person agency and then co-founding a 20-person PR agency as well. And that brings me up to date.
Nice. I remember, speaking of like getting started in digital marketing a long time ago, I will date myself now because webmaster was the only job back when I was like starting out after college. It was just like, well, do you want to be a webmaster? And I'm like, what is that? I don't even know.
Well,
all right.
I just quickly, when I studied at university, I studied marketing, but they didn't teach us anything to do with digital. So I bought the book down here, Web Marketing for Dummies. And that basically taught me everything I knew to get a job. And then I learned the rest on the job.
That's great. All right, let's jump into what I like most about the show is the case studies. So the first one you're going to share has to do with how to leverage thought leadership and using that to start good conversations.
Yeah, so this is back in a company that I worked at previously, and we noticed that we started to get a few new customers that had recently raised a round of funding, typically a Series A. And we thought, well, this is a segment that is actively growing and they're looking to invest in the service that we were selling at the time. But we really didn't have that much experience or anybody in the team, on the marketing team, to talk about what to do once you've raised a round of funding. So what we ended up doing was reaching out to people on different sides of the table. So 2 people that had raised a round of funding, and then 2 people that have worked with companies and multiple companies that have raised a round of funding, specifically a Series A. And what we asked them to do is to answer a few questions around the challenges about sales when it comes to once you've raised that Series A, what are the challenges that you're going to face? What are the successes that you've had? What has worked for you and what didn't work for you? And then the third question was any advice that they would share for other people who have raised a Series A and the things to look out for. So we reached out to those 4 different people, asked them all the same question. And then we essentially just edited the videos together as one long form piece of content. And then we broke them into 3 separate videos, which were 4 people talking about each question. So we finally had some content that we hoped would resonate with our audience. So then we began to build a list of potential companies that we knew had just raised a round of funding because we used Crunchbase and some other databases to find that info. And we reached out to those people or to those VP of sales, which is typically the title, saying that we have this content, we put together these thought leaders. Would you like us to send it across to you? Never mentioning what we did, not pitching our service whatsoever. We just wanted to get a reply from them. Once we got the reply, we could point them in the right direction of the blog post. And on that blog post, we had calls to actions and a bit more explanation about what we did. And then, of course, in the follow-up, once they had said, yes, they'd like it, we followed up to ask them if they have checked it out, if they have any questions, does any of it resonate with them? And that's really how we started a lot more conversations than what we were getting with just our normal outbound approach where we were potentially pretty much pitching our service.
Yeah, that's nice. So here's what I'm curious about, because I've done this for my business where, you try to capture content. I've asked for quotes. I've done interviews. I used to write blog posts for LinkedIn back in the day. And I would always kind of say, hey, I'm writing a new piece. I'd love to interview you. Super hard to get some people to want to be on record. So I'm curious, as you did your outreach, what did you sense was like, whether it's a percentage or if you figured out like these are the people who are just more comfortable on camera or recording on a podcast, like navigate that dynamic, because I've always struggled with trying to figure out what works best.
Yeah, so one of the ways to identify if these people will be comfortable on camera is if they've already produced videos themselves or they've spoken on other podcasts. So we mainly reached out to those people that had, and they are comfortable on camera, and we could see the videos that they've had on YouTube or other podcast interviews that they've been on as well. And then also I use my network too. So because I had so much experience in that industry, I did have a few people I could call on. The ones that were much more proactive and happy to talk were almost like the agencies or the service providers that helped those companies, which you can imagine why, because it's good exposure for them. But I did get a couple of VPs of sales or at Series A companies, or maybe one of them had been a VP of sales, moved on to a different role, but asked him to talk about his experience anecdotally. So we didn't ask them to mention the specific companies, but we just asked them for their experience of going through that process.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the screening tool that you kind of built in, which was, hey, if they've already done it, they're more inclined to say yes. In my podcast outreach, I've found the same thing. Can't always get your dream guess, but yeah, they've already been qualified because they're comfortable. And it's funny how, whether it's shooting video or recording podcast, there's just a chunk of the people out there who just aren't comfortable doing it. They think they're not going to be good, or they don't have anything interesting to say, which is like usually far from the truth. But it is an interesting psychological part of of getting people to talk. Sometimes they're just like, nope, not comfortable.
Yeah. In one of my other companies, we partnered with a voice and presentation coach, and we offered an hour session with her so she could help the customers that we worked with just be more confident on the on camera and speaking on interviews. And one of the tactics or methods that she talks about is the pint and a half effect. So she's from the UK, so pints are very popular in the UK, so a pint of beer. And she said, just imagine that you're sitting in the pub with a friend and you've had a beer and a half and you're just talking. You're just talking to your friend. That's all you're doing. And it kind of removes some of that fear that people have about public speaking. And if you just imagine you've had a beer and you're talking to a friend, it can make the whole experience a lot more easy for you to do a good job.
Yeah, I like that. That's great advice. Pint and a half. That still works in America. That plays well. We understand. We understand pint and a half. So what was the outcome of all this? Like, you're getting good conversations. Are you seeing increased engagement and conversion rates as opposed to when you didn't do this type of an approach?
Yeah, we certainly did. We actually had a lot of people saying thank you and what do you do? So they were just curious as to why we were making the effort to send this content across. Not thousands of people, but we as an agency at the time didn't need hundreds of new customers every month. So we had a lot of people that were interested in finding out more, really the reason why we were producing this content in the first place. And that led to a number of discovery calls and then a number of customers signing up and working with us.
Yeah. Where do you think like this type of a tactic, it feels like an evergreen strategy, meaning like as long as you're authentic and you're initially not trying to pitch, it should work. Are you seeing more and more people do this and there's less engagement? How has this played out over time?
Yeah, I think the tactic works. The context is most important. So I think a lot of people see the strategy and they try and replicate it, but they haven't really done the research to find out, is this really a pain or is this really a problem that our buyer personas really care about? So yeah, the tactic, like any tactic, can work as long as you've got the right content in this case and the right context. So really understanding who your ideal customers are and those buyer personas and what their challenges and responsibilities are. You can easily look at a job description of 10 different job descriptions of your buyer persona, see what the commonalities are between all of those job descriptions, to see what those objectives and responsibilities are, and then just start ticking off those bullet points. And that's where you can create content. No SEO research or keyword analysis, just look for the pains and the challenges that they have.
Yep. Love the pain. I really feel like if you're not leading with pain, it's an uphill battle. You either have to have a great relationship with someone to get their attention, or it's super tough. So I like the pain. Anything else on the first case study before we jump into the next one?
Just to share that it wasn't as hard as it sounds to create. It was a few conversations. It was recorded over Zoom. We had one of our marketing managers just to cut and edit the videos, but nothing fancy. It was raw. It was an interview. And it's really, really effective. I think personally, since COVID and everybody worked from home, the production quality expectations from people has gone down a little bit. As long as the content's great, it doesn't really matter that it's not in a studio and you're sitting down having a fireside conversation with somebody. So don't let technology and don't let these other things stop you from at least trying it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do feel like the expectations are lower. Also, the gear is a little bit better. So you really, for not a lot of money, can pull off a decent studio.
Yeah. I mean, I'm using my iPhone as the web camera here, and I'm just got that plugged into my computer using an app, which was $30 or $40. And the new iOS has released its own app that can handle this as well. And then a trusty Blue Yeti USB microphone, which cost me maybe £100, $100 about 5 years ago. And it's still working.
All right, cool. Let's jump into case study number 2. This one is kind of related to what we're doing right now on a podcast. So this case study is all about how to leverage podcasts to get in front of the people that you want.
Yeah, so it's for the same company that I was working for with the first case study. And one of the things that was a challenge for us was building up our own audience and getting people to sign up to a newsletter, because not everybody wants to sign up to a newsletter. So you put out some content and it kind of goes into the wind, and you just hope that people will see it. Of course, SEO can kick in. So what we thought about doing was, well, who else shares the same audience that we want to work with, but sell or offer a different service to that audience? So there's no kind of direct competition there at all. So we identified a number of podcasts which had the audience that we wanted to reach. And then we reached out to the podcast hosts, asked them if they're interested in talking about this topic and this topic, which is related to, again, to that audience. We tried to make those topics as valuable as possible to the audience who are listening, because we thought that podcast hosts will care about the quality of the guests, and they certainly did. We also asked the hosts if they wanted to change anything. Like, it wasn't us coming on here to talk about ABC and that's it. So it was very much a collaborative process. This is about 4 or 5 years ago now. So this strategy hadn't been done as much as perhaps it is now. And we managed to land a number of different interviews on sales-related podcasts. One interview turned into 8 conversations, and 4 of those from that 8 turned into customers. So it was a really quick ROI. But what I learned after is that it's not always that quick, and it's sometimes a lot longer game that you need to play.
Yeah. I really enjoy podcasting as a way, obviously, just to meet new people, but I agree. There is some great new business opportunities, and obviously you're trying to build a genuine relationship. Otherwise, it falls apart. But I think that what I've been on other people's podcasts or they've been on mine, there's never been a feeling of like, okay, here comes the hard pitch. But
exactly. The other thing that's come from that as well is a few years later, people still get in touch with you saying, "Oh, I heard you on the so-and-so podcast talking about XYZ. Can I just pick your brains? Or are you still working at that company? I need help with that." And I think that's what's great about podcasts. You mentioned evergreen as the previous strategy, but the podcasting space is completely evergreen too. And what I think is extremely powerful is when somebody has the challenge or problem and you've spoken about that challenge or problem and you did a good job conveying your knowledge and expertise, most people, if they want to kind of get in touch with you, they will, because they can use the fact that they heard you on the interview to start that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing too, like I've noticed when people have reached out saying, "Oh, I just watched that podcast about whatever topic," the dynamic really changes. So if they're coming to me to use my agency, all of a sudden they've already said like, "I already know who you are. I get you.
Yep.
Like, you don't even have to like do anything. I just want to talk." And that's also fun for me, because then I don't have to do the 5 to 10 minute overview of everything. So it's really efficient.
Yeah, I've had it a couple times where someone says, "Yep, I get it. I get what you're about. I like what you're about. How do I work with you? How does it work?"
Yes.
And I mean, that's just such a great conversation to lead to a sale.
Yeah. So take us through, like, I want to get a little bit more detailed on this strategy. Like, what are it seems very straightforward, right? But give us like the steps that you have to go through to do this successfully.
Yeah, I'll kind of give you like the 80-20. So the 20% of the things that you can do, which gives you the most impact. So when you're trying to identify the steps are: research the podcast, reach out to the podcast, manage the back and forth of the booking, and then turn up and do a good interview. So 4 steps there. The first one is, how do you find the podcasts that are speaking to the same audience? A little bit like what we talked about in the first case study of reaching out to people who have already spoken on those shows. So I would look at who are the other influencers or other people that share my audience, and then just put in their name and then podcast and see which podcast they've been on. And you can make an assumption that they've vetted that podcast or that show is right for them based on the audience. And you obviously can double check that. There's a great website called listennotes.com. It's probably the most comprehensive directory of podcasts. It's pretty much free to use as well. So that way you can actually search for keywords. So if you're trying to get to HR directors, so HR or human resources podcasts, there'll be lots of podcasts with that title. And Listen Notes gives you some metadata around each of those podcasts as well. So that's the research step. Can I go any deeper on that, Steve?
Yeah, go deeper. Go deeper. Yeah. I like it.
So when you are looking at the shows, one thing that's really useful to do is pull out a couple of guests or things that have been spoken about previously and make a note of those, because that's what you can use to increase your outreach or the likelihood of them replying to your outreach.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I want to get your thoughts on too on the actual outreach. What I've learned, what I've done it for my show is 3 sentences max. Like that's it for that initial email. What's your experience been like?
Yeah, I think rule number one is make it all about the host and their audience. Rule number two is keep it short as possible. And number three is to remove the work for the host. So how I would approach that is saying something along the lines of, "Hey, Steve, I saw you had so and so influencer in my industry on your podcast who talked about XYZ, wondering or curious if your audience would be interested in a different view or another strategy, or I actually disagree with that strategy and here's why. Would that be of interest to your audience?" So maybe a little bit more than 3 sentences, definitely 3 paragraphs, no more. But you're making it extremely relevant. You show that you've done your research by referencing a previous guest and what they spoke about. You're doing the work for the host to come up with a topic. Of course, listen to that show first because certain podcasts have certain structure to them as well. So you want to make sure that you're not trying to convince the podcast host to change their whole structure. And then that call to action at the end is just it's known as a soft call to action. Would your audience find this valuable? If you've done that research, you've made that relevant message, there's never going to be a no to that answer.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the closing question too. Nothing like a good close in an email. Good question.
Yeah.
All right. What else about the case study would you like to share?
Yeah. So from that case study, like I said, I generated customers straight away. And I got lucky with that, to be honest. But the reason why I was able to convert those customers is because I went on a really, really, really specific podcast, which was about cold email, where the podcast host wants you to talk through a case study, very similar to this type of format, which was specific results and how you got to those results. The podcast was quite new. It didn't have millions of downloads. And this is the key with this strategy or as a case study here is you don't need the biggest podcasts. You just need the ones that have the most relevant audience that you want to reach. So that would be something else that I would share about this particular case study.
Yeah. All right. Nice. All right, let's jump into Q&A. I want you to tell us about your first job in marketing. What were you doing? Go back as far as you can. I love the childhood stories when it comes to marketing jobs, but how'd you get started?
Yeah, well, funny enough, I went straight from university into work. I did a placement year as part of my university degree so that I worked in industry, then went back to do my final year. And I kind of fell into recruitment and I enjoyed it. So I stayed in recruitment for so long. But I was recruiting marketers in the company that I was working for. And there just wasn't that many candidates out there. And at the same time, or about 6 months before, I'd started playing around with WordPress websites and building a website in WordPress for my dad and for a friend who was a personal trainer. So I really got some hands-on experience and actually saw that I had sometimes more experience with building websites, for example, than the average marketer who was applying for roles. And around this time, there was 2 types of marketers who, one, knew that they had to learn digital, but didn't really want to. And then the other type were those who were, let's just say, a little bit younger, and they were growing into the marketing role as digital became more important. So I knew that my competition was quite low, and I had the skills from recruitment to talk my way into that job.
Yeah,
I was the first digital marketing hire for a data center design and build company, which is as sexy as it sounds.
Yeah, that's really funny. I mean, I think it's great. I've worked with recruiters a long time, and it's funny how you really get to, as a recruiter, you get to learn so much. Every day you're learning about people's backgrounds. And I've always admired that of the recruiters that I know is you're constantly soaking things up. And they're oftentimes more knowledgeable than any one candidate or any one like CMO because they just know what's happening in the industry.
100% agree. And I think a little bit like, especially in the UK, estate agents get a very bad reputation. Or realtors in the US. Recruiters also have that same stigma, but there are good ones out there. And I think they are genuinely a fountain of knowledge for insights into the industry, what's changing, how the roles are adapting as well. So I've always looked to partner with other recruiters who serve the same audience as me to see if there's any partnerships that we can come up with as well, if it aligns with what it is that we're doing.
One thing I also like about your first job is that you were doing everything and you were very hands-on. And I think sometimes marketers who don't get that experience because let's say they go to a really big company and at big companies, you may need 10, 20 people to actually come together to create something. But I've always admired people who can just either if it's on the side or at a small company, do everything so that you really understand like the difference in front end and back end and tracking. And it's helped me a lot because I think when I was working at really large companies and I would hear from people trying to like pitch me services, I'd be like, oh, wait, isn't that just as simple as like putting
Yeah.
this code there? Like,
Mhm.
isn't that like 30 seconds to do?
Yeah.
So you could really kind of see through a lot of the fluff out there when I was buying it, because you just knew how simple some of these things were.
I agree. We worked with an agency who had a 48-hour turnaround to update the website. And I was just like, well, no, I'll just go into the back end and just make a few changes. And then it's like, well, you can't do that because we've custom coded WordPress, which was built in a way that you should be able to just go into the back end and change the post title. But the way that the agency had built it took away that functionality. So in the end, part of me moving into that role, we got rid of the agency and I took over the responsibility for most of the stuff that they were doing. So I should have asked for a lot more in terms of my salary, I guess.
Yeah. It is funny when you have that knowledge and you just go, well, just hit publish.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
yeah, like we'll just look at it on the dev site or what, and it's interesting.
Mhm.
But I understand agencies sometimes,
Me too.
are intentionally doing it, or they just don't know any better.
Mhm.
They were taught that way, and I'm sure there's good intent behind it. Where it's like, well, we like to have 3 people QA it. We just don't want one person to
Yeah.
push it live.
Yeah.
So you've been in marketing good amount of time now. What is it that gets you kind of excited these days? What's on the horizon that you're like, this is where it's really going to be interesting?
Yeah, I think this is a good question because I think we can get excited by new technology and chat GPT and AI and all of this like silver bullets that come flying at us as a marketer. But one thing that doesn't change fundamentally is that we're marketing and selling effectively to humans. And the way that we buy, whilst the buyer's journey has changed, but deep rooted in psychology is pretty much the same. There has to be some trust. There is some element of persuasion when it comes to selling, but not really nasty and manipulative persuasion, but just using particular tactics to help people make a decision. So what I really enjoy about marketing is that as a skill, if you hone it, it doesn't matter what tactic or what industry or what vertical that you're trying to market to, because you can always fall back on the fundamentals and then maybe learn the new tools, learn ChatGPT or learn TikTok, for example. So that's what keeps me excited about marketing. I have the fundamentals and I get to experiment with lots of new different tools and technology.
Someone I used to work with had a funny saying. They'd been in marketing for over 20 years, and they go, look, every strategy has already been developed. There are no new business strategies. Of course, the tactics change. And I always kind of, the longer I've spent in marketing, the more I've agreed to it, is you see all these different strategies, and now it's just when to use them or how to implement them differently.
Definitely. I think as well, marketing has a reputation of relabeling things. So account-based marketing, dark funnel or dark social, where they have pre-names from 5 years ago, but marketing is remarketing their own kind of terminology. So I always find that quite funny. I chuckle to myself.
Well, I wonder when the term marketing might go away, because the
Yeah.
marketers rebranded marketing. That never seems to go away. But what's one thing that just drives you nuts? Is it the abundance of technological choices that can be paralyzing? Like what just as a marketer gets you kind of like, we got to stop doing this. It's driving me nuts.
Yeah. So there is an abundance of technology, and I think really a lot of people try to look at technology and build out a use case. So they look at a tool and go, "Oh, I guess I could use it to do this." Whereas what they should really do is go, "What are the challenges that I have right now, and where could I use technology to improve that process?" That's not what winds me up. What really winds me up, you can tell in my tone now, Steve, is International Pizza Day. And a company will on LinkedIn or on Twitter go, "Oh, we're celebrating International People Day, International Pizza Day," and there's nothing else behind that post or tweet other than the fact that it's a day in the calendar and somebody has thought it's a good idea to tweet about it because it happens to be on the 12th of July or whatever it may be. I just think that's super lazy. The other thing, you got me on one now. The other thing is Valentine's Day and then getting a 10% discount on email verification because it's Valentine's Day. No sense whatsoever. No attempt to tie Valentine's Day to email validation. So I just think that's quite lazy marketing, and I don't appreciate it, as you can tell from my tone.
Yeah. At least go to the extent of saying like, we love emails that get delivered. I don't know. That would be the easy way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm with you. There's a lot of laziness. And when I've done my own research for like, what are the days going on in a given month, it's just, there's too many. It's not even like ice cream day or or cookie day. It's chocolate chip cookie day or oatmeal raisin. It's like,
Yeah.
there must have been a bunch of PR lobbyists who were like, we got you, the oatmeal cookie day gets on the national calendar.
Yeah.
All right. This could be its own episode on rants about bad, lazy marketing. What if you look back like over your career that you would have done differently? You know, like there's so many things when I look at like my first 5 to 8 years in marketing, I kind of chuckle about things I've done. What about you? What have you kind of said, oh man, I totally had that wrong?
Yeah, I think for me, I would have been more intentional about building connections and relationships with people. Like I've done that later in my career. But I think I wouldn't have been, or I shouldn't have had that fear of reaching out to somebody who's ahead of me or somebody who I could learn from, or even somebody who's, I don't want to say beneath me, but just starting out. Let's say I was 2 years in and I could actually reach out to somebody who's just starting and offer some help. Because as I've got older and as my network has increased, the more that I've given to my network without expecting anything in return, the more stuff that comes back to me. And again, I can't say that it's this one conversation I had in July 2006 that yielded this result. But just by freely giving and not being afraid to ask questions and to seek help and seek mentorship, most people are nice people and most people like helping others. So I think I wouldn't have been as afraid of reaching out or thinking that somebody wouldn't want to talk to me because I've just started.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I think I remember when I was early in my career, and there was much more of an established hierarchy in business 20, 25 years ago, where it was like, well, that person is 3 levels up.
Yeah.
Things have flattened out quite a bit these days. And even the idea of reverse mentorship is something that sometimes a really senior person would welcome a junior person. You know, like I remember when I was leading social media for people, like the people on my team doing it were like, yeah, like the CMO wants direct access to you because he wants to learn more about social. So like build that relationship. It's good to see that happen. All right. As we wrap up the show, I'm going to think of one more question. All right. You know what? Maybe I'll turn it on you. What's the one question I should be asking you? What is something that you want to share with people in the spirit of kind of giving and educating them about this, you know, the space that you've been in? What do you think they should really understand?
I think I wasn't prepared for this question, but the question is, I think one of the great questions is, how do you learn more about your buyers? Because ultimately, that's what good, solid marketing does. You create a message that gets sent to the right person at the right time. And for me, it's all about relevancy, but you can't be relevant without really understanding who your customers are and what their challenges may be. And as you mentioned before about the pain points that they're experiencing. In B2B sales and decision-making, the majority of decisions, I think it's around 70% or it might be 80% of decisions are made to avoid a pain or loss than it is to gain something. So how do we find out what those people's pains are? So using job descriptions, for example, when in the past I've had a saved calendar appointment with a link to LinkedIn jobs in the calendar, and I look at 5 to 10 job posts every week of my persona that I'm trying to sell to. If I was selling to B2B marketers 4 years ago, TikTok would never have showed up in a job description. Whereas if you look at it now, it might do. So what are those changes? What are those patterns that you should be looking for? So those are the things that I use to find out more about my buyers. And then also, having been in sales and working in recruitment, which is very pick up the phone and boiler room-esque, I've never been afraid of speaking to people. And I feel like that's been a huge advantage in my marketing career when I work with other marketers who would never pick up the phone and speak to a prospect, or never pick up the phone and speak to a customer, or go out of their way to an event and speak to some of the people that they don't want to sell to that individual, but want to learn about the role and the challenges that they have. So the advice to learn more is to have more conversations with the people that you're trying to communicate with. Remove the fact that you're trying to sell something to them eventually and just have a conversation. You'll learn so much more.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. All right, we've reached the end of the podcast. We can celebrate philosophically with our pint and a half. I will always remember the pint and a half advice that I learned today. Brilliant. So I really enjoyed having you on the podcast, Mark, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom.
Cheers, Steve. It's been great. Awesome questions. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining the podcast today, and we will see you next time on Studio 26. Take care.
Thanks for tuning in to the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. If you found value in today's episode, please help grow the podcast by sharing with others and leaving a review. We'll see you next time.